Hi, everyone, and welcome to Intelligence and Noise, the GSMA intelligence podcast, where we sort through the news of the week, try to add some intelligence to the things that you're probably already paying attention to, and sift through the noise, the stuff that maybe you aren't looking at, and telling you why maybe you should be. As always, not as always, but as often, I'm here with Tim. Hey, Tim, how you doing?
You're good. How are you?
Good, good, good. We're in the middle of the summer, which means things are supposed to be slowing down, but they're not, which is good
Nice.
because it gives us something to talk about. So we got a lot on the docket today. We're going to be talking 6G. We're going to be talking quantum. As always, we'll be talking AI because it is 2026, which means we can't get away from AI. And it's not just because it's summer. I'm going to kick off my story time with Peter introduction here with uh, a bit of something that maybe comes out of left field. So it's about young people and drinking. I mean, it's the summer, right? It is time to kick back with something in the heat. But what's interesting is I saw recently some news out of the IWSR. And if you don't know what the IWSR is, I mean, you're in the telco world, so you can be forgiven. It's originally the International Wine and Spirits Record. Uh, like many organizations, they just go by an acronym now. It's a reminder it is MWC, not Mobile World Congress. So please let's get that right and let's refer to it as IWSR. If you ever see any of those folks, they're in London. We should go and see them sometime, Tim, or have them into the office. They're a group that does a lot of research around beverages, as you might think, wine and spirits and other things. And it was the middle of the month, middle of last month of July. They put out some news that was talking about Gen Z drinking habits. Um, and kind of important because a lot of the news out there has recently been about, hey, young people don't drink, young people are drinking less. You see that's driven a whole bunch of different changes to businesses. I think to some extent that probably drove a bit of the no and low alcohol beverage industry, or at a much different level, right? You've got folks in various regions who are ripping out vineyards. Alcohol consumption is going down. Young people aren't drinking. But what's interesting is the study came out and it showed young people are drinking about Gen Z's drinking about almost exactly the same amount, actually the same amount of time as the general population. I think the numbers here say across 15 markets they looked at, the share of Gen Z drinking is at 74%, up from 66% 3 years ago. It's nearly identical to the rest of the population. There's all sorts of interesting details about who drinks less, who drinks more. And of course, you can ask how much they're drinking, right? It doesn't mean that they're drinking as much as other folks. All sorts of interesting information other than just chatting about alcohol. What is the point? What's interesting is when I think about a few years ago, right? And we talk about 3 years ago, I think we were in COVID. One of the big questions was, what is this going to mean for networks? And it was on the telco side of things, changes everything that we know about usage patterns, right? Changes. People are using it in different times, right? They're using it from different places. This is changing things forever. Everyone's going to work from home forever. It's no one's going to go to stores. They're going to be ordering. They've gotten used to so much, getting used to having their food delivered to them. No one's going back. Offices are going to be empty, and then there we go, and the offices fill up, and the telecom networks go back to something more akin to what it was. But then it's going to change in another 2 weeks when something else comes up. And what I think is interesting is, for me, it reminded me of these conversations about how more than questions of is data traffic going up, is data traffic going down, is what does variability look like? And how do we think about building in flexibility, right? How do you, if you're in an alcohol business, build flexibility into your business model to adjust for the fact that young folks may drink? One day we may think they're drinking more, one day we might think they're drinking less. That changes. As a telco, how do you build flexibility how do you think about what your future network looks like, recognizing that these things change now, our understanding of them changes, right? We might think very much this is what's happening one day, and we learn something more. It's not to say that we got it wrong, it's just you learn something more, and that changes. And that's particularly important now because we are on the cusp of 6G, and that brings us to our first story. People planning for Tim is always amazed. You never see you don't see you don't see where I'm going and how I'm actually.
Well, Peter, can I just say on that? I never told you this before, but my original childhood dream was to start a brewery. So the fact that you have brought this story up has given me new insights to factor into how I do that.
Don't
This
give
is
up.
great timing.
Don't give up on those childhood dreams. Gen Z is going, and apparently part of this news is that Gen Z is more likely to also be drinking with other people, with friends. So it's a
Ah,
social thing, which is not bad. So yes, Tim's going to open a brewery, and we're going to talk 6G, the first
we are.
story of today. And I think for those of you who uh, haven't listened before, we always couch this within the constructs of the GSMA CEO newsletter that goes out, and we talk about one of the two stories that made it into the newsletter, one of the two stories that didn't, that could have there, but for the grace of our DG, goes to the stories that get picked. And one of the two that got picked was the new 6G alliance that was announced by the NTIA. We say new, but it was sort of flagged in. It was flagged in March, I believe. It was flagged early on. There was a call to action, and there wasn't necessarily. It didn't form right then, but we sort of saw it coming back then. But now we saw it just last week. Technically, call to action for 6G leadership and security. So it's a bit of a mouthful. Tim, there's a lot to unpack here, but thoughts and maybe some more details on what it is for folks that didn't read the full news.
Yeah, really interesting story. And to your point, let's put some context around this. So this is an announcement from the U.S. government to start we would call it a coalition of the willing of allied partners who are getting together to essentially shape 6G, whether that is from how the business architecture looks like, the technical architecture, and feeding into standards. They've announced this. You're right, Peter. They trailed it in March. I would say even it's probably been earlier than that informally, given how the U.S. government has sought to take a leadership position in shaping technologies that are of strategic national significance. Um, I think the interesting point for me, Peter, there's a couple interesting angles, and I want to get your perspective on it. One is, we haven't really seen this before. Typically, mobile technology cycles are stipulated by standards bodies and various associations, not usually led by kind of geopolitically driven efforts. This is the first time that we've seen that. I think that's a point of interest. Secondly, and I want to get your reaction to this, I think it's as interesting for who is in the alliance versus who is not. We see over 20 countries lined up. Most of them are Western allies of the US, the UK, Japan, etc. We don't see any of the BRIC countries. There is no China, there's no Russia, Brazil, India. And I think that says some interesting things about where the current states of alignment are on that. Not saying they can't get bought in, but I got some other thoughts. Well, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that so far?
So I think, I mean, stopping short of my thoughts, what I think is interesting is if you look to see what other, what folks in the media have been talking about, and look at some of the headlines, right? So if I look at a handful of the headlines that are out there from different folks, right? You've got, anything from NTIA plans to launch a 6G call to action to unite allies, right? And that was back from March,
Yep.
right? When this first called out. And then you look, more recently, right? You've got, Uncle Sam needs you to fight for 6G leadership and security, lest Beijing get there first, right? It's a bit It's straightforward. Folks, friends over at SDX Central, US wants quote unquote like-minded nations to join 6G software-led project to counter China. So clearly in the media, there's obviously a big focus on who is not there, including China. What I think is interesting though, and to be fair, right? I think when we were looking at it, my first, one of my first takes was you got 20 or so countries in there. That's about 18% of global mobile connections, 25% if you're looking at 5G. But what's interesting is, and it's always difficult to break down intellectual property and standard submissions by country. But if you look at some stuff that's out there from various folks that's been publicly reported, including the folks at IPlytics, Etsy Analyses, so some academic studies, you find that if you take those 20 countries and you sort of ask, hey, what share of 3GPP submissions standards do they likely account for? The conservative number is that the alliance accounts for about 55 to 60%. And that's the conservative estimate, right? If you look at an aggressive estimate, it's 75 to 85%.
Yep.
And now granted, that's all the 3GPP, so maybe less weighted, maybe more weighted towards back end than going forward the 5G side of things. And who knows what it'll be for 6G. So yeah, so I think you can make the argument, and the media is making the argument that this is just as much about who's not in there versus who is. Um, but they've got you can't deny that they've got the heavy hitters in terms of who are forming that. Now, again, you talked about the geopolitical angle, what's there. Um, yeah, you can't ignore that, right? I mean, I think it's obviously a little bit too in your face.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a shrewd point, and I think the patent point speaks to why they're doing this now as well. I mean, we are at a point where we're late in the 5G cycle. We're 8 years in. You have a 6G on the horizon, 2028, 2029. I think the industry recognizes that it is a nationally important technology. They also recognize, however, that there were lessons to be learned from 5G, which, from a monetization angle and how that is fed through the 6G design, can be addressed through this type of initiative. I look at some of the stakeholders talking about, for example, avoiding a two-phase network rollout. We had 5G non-standalone, with the exception of China, that then went to standalone. That was sort of a product of circumstance, but I think most people will want to not have that when it comes to 6G. So for me, the interesting points, putting aside the geopolitics of it, are what do we see this alliance, produce in terms of, impactful outcomes? And do we, secondly, start to see either more joiners to this or similar initiatives in other hemispheres of the
Yeah,
world? I
yeah. I
think
think I
that's
think
an
that
interesting over.
the new joiners one's a real interesting one. And to your point about timing, like just on a timing side of things, it's interesting because I was just thinking about this on another subject today. Like it seems silly now to not talk about 5G, 6G, right? We wouldn't have done that 3, 4 years ago. You'd be like oh, we don't have 5G, 6G, we're in the 5G. But now we know like, and just the fact that we're doing that says, okay, we know it's coming pretty soon. I think as to the goals here, right? And again, we'll see if this expands to other folks. What I think is interesting is if you look at sort of the call to action. One of the things I think is particularly interesting is one of the points they make. It's I think it's verbatim quoting here. Global communication systems are inherently interconnected, which can introduce cyber, economic, and national security risks for us individually and as partners. Whether within or across borders, exposure to high risk 5G or 6G infrastructure. And that term high risk, right? I mean, um, I think we all know that the term high risk vendors has been used across many of the markets that are included in here to flag specific suppliers. So I think that kind of does go a little bit to the point of who is in versus who is not. The flip side is I think this will be where I'm interested to see what actually comes out of this. Is if you go through the document and you look for recurring phrases and comments. And this is, you know, This is where our friend AI becomes a godsend because you don't have to go through and look for you don't have to go through or hire an intern or send it off to somewhere, but you can say, "Hey, help me out here. What do you find?" Yeah, 6G leadership at the top, of course, right? Not surprising. But you get secure, resilient, open, interoperable, secure, resilient, AI supported. So it's this focus on interoperability, this focus on open. I mean, you get down to when you get down to contact group, you know that you're getting away from things that actually matter. But resource efficient, not surprising, resilience, not. But it's that interoperable, open.
Yep.
It comes up again, again, and again, and what that means in terms of open, where that line is between open and who are included. I think that will be fun to see how they walk that line because that's
And it's
we know, yeah, they
also
know they need to be.
definitely, and we're going to talk a little bit about AT&T's LLM efforts with OTEL later in the podcast. But I think it's also an interesting point to think about, what does open mean now? I mean, we've talked about open in several contexts before. This is almost a tacit admission that to be successful with 6G, cards on the table now. And both from a vendor and telco perspective, to understand where it makes sense to join up, join forces, work in a quote unquote open way versus what needs to be proprietary. But I think having the interesting point for me is really around the timings. It's getting the conversation now ahead of deployment rather than after the fact.
And that is the other part, though, right? Of I think then to maybe the note to end on is to see where does this is it more than just conversations, right? They've got a
Yep.
nice
Yeah.
timeline. They've got a whole set of within 1 month we'll do this and do that. And we're going to start conversations. And then after that, we will identify who I like that level of detail in a call to action was actually kind of it was on the one hand, it was a little bit administrative, like bureaucratic. Do we need to see for the whole public that within 3 months everyone's going to have their identified representative? But it's good because it shows they're moving forward. I guess the question is then, what happens to reduce fragmentation? What actually comes out of this, and what impact does it have? And then, because you called it out, more than just being secure and interoperable, do we make or can we make progress on the fundamental issues that we know are critical, which is monetization, right? And
Yep.
how are we going to make money from these things? And it doesn't, it's unclear how much of that, because it is a call to action on, on security and 6G leadership. But if this is not monetizable, um, then that's going to be a problem. On the monetization front, then that leads us into two stories that we could have chosen from that didn't get picked. We want to talk a bit about quantum. Before we go to quantum, we can't not talk about AWS
We should
or
talk
Amazon.
about it. We
It's not
talked.
AWS. It's Amazon. Apologies,
That's right.
apologies
The
to
story,
yes
just
to
for
Mr.
our listeners,
Bezos.
the story Peter is talking about is the Amazon satellite story, which took place last week, where Amazon has now filed with the FCC to increase its satellite constellation to just over 5,000 satellites to be commercially launched from 2028. And I think we talk a lot about satellite, and there is a risk of satellite fatigue when there has been so much in the news on this. I think that's fair. But two things that are interesting here. One, Amazon is moving fast. Obviously, we had the Global Star acquisition of the spectrum in the spring. That MSS spectrum will be incorporated as the key enabler for this constellation. Two, it takes Amazon's planned footprint from a little over 3,000 to 5,000. So we're talking about like a 50% plus increase in the constellation size. And I think that is interesting because it speeds the time to market and brings a new competitor to Starlink using a different model, because Amazon has been quite clear that they intend to deploy this in partnership with carrier partners rather than as a direct to consumer, at least at first.
And this
So I
is
think, Peter,
and
it's something to follow.
no, it is, and that's why if you are lucky enough, and I say it all the time, you're lucky enough to be on that distro for the CEO newsletter, you saw that was in there because it is, as much as there's fatigue, it is important for all those reasons that moving fast, where this goes. I will say my slip of the tongue makes me wonder, Will, will Amazon eventually will they put their satellite efforts under AWS in the same way, Musk has moved things around? I think that would be a fun, I doesn't seem likely. But anyways, of the stories that didn't get picked, um, I think the one that we want to talk about is, and I like this when this happens, right? Where we end up seeing a story that is not just like one thing happened, although it's important, like the 6G alliance, great, but where it's more of a theme or a trend, or you see some signals and we can group them together. I like that partly because that's what we should be doing as analysts. It also, I think, points to a theme. This is around quantum. So we saw two unrelated, well, the two related but unconnected stories last week. One, AT&T working with D-Wave to talk about quantum for network ops, extending some work they're doing with them. And then one where Telefonica was working with Worth on quantum in logistics. Um, and for me, and I think you're right, I think in the same way we talk about uh, satellite exhaust when you see some satellite news, I think for a lot of folks, there's probably a bit of quantum exhaust where there's a lot of discussions around quantum, and we've been talking, particularly because we've been talking about it for so long,
Yeah.
right? We've been talking about quantum for however many years, and it seems like we're still talking about it. But for me, this was an interesting story because both point to one, a role for telcos, but also a role for quantum beyond encryption. Like I think so much the telco focus sides around post quantum cryptography. How do we make sure that we're preparing for a future when you can crack anything? And this gives us an idea of like how telcos can possibly monetize quantum in ways that we don't always talk about. You're thinking of either or both of the pieces.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it is something we need to highlight. I mean, you talked about quantum has really, at least in the telco sector, been seen as something on a security perspective. Why? There are compute capabilities that quantum offers to help preempt security risks. And also, we know that it introduces vulnerabilities. I think our own research, we published a report earlier this year. 7% of IoT devices, like of the 30 billion that are in active use, are quantum ready, meaning there is a huge latent liability there. What we've seen through these stories, though, putting the security side, is with Telefonica and AT&T, is as you mentioned, is a quantum use in the business that can be either monetized or has direct cost savings. The Telefonica one was interesting. They are looking at a logistics use case here, where the quantum compute can help sort through the organization of a number of tasks. In the instance they talked about, it's actually stocking boxes for transport, and it led to around a 5% reduction, just under that, in terms of the end user result. May not sound like a huge amount, but actually, when you scale up to billions of devices, or in this case, hundreds of thousands of millions of boxes, that's significant. The AT&T side is really around network optimization. And again, when we will talk about some of AT&T's efforts on AI in a bit, but when you're talking about scanning billions of functions every day and you get down to 20 or 30% gains, which are being reported from the use of quantum, that has real impacts in terms of how the business is run. So I think strategically, Peter, we're now moving from talking about quantum as a buzzword and a topic to seeing real world proof points.
Well, it doesn't mean there aren't monetization opportunities around security, right? I mean, you can think of if telcos can leverage quantum to help folks be more secure, right? Delivering security as a service, secure SIM solutions, tying into sovereign hosting solutions, like there's clearly there. I think the other part that's interesting here, right, is yes, you've got the AT&T side of things with optimization, and they're not the first. Like I think there's been a whole bunch of other folks that have talked a bit about what they're doing, right? I think you know, Docomo was talking about that earlier. We see some Telstra stuff. But what I think is interesting is in the Telefonica side, you're looking at sort of a vertical focus there, right? Where it's actually thinking about what a vertical needs and then leveraging quantum to help them out, which again goes to the larger B2B solution, right? I am always, because I don't know exactly, and how complex these things are. We've been doing optimization for a while around all these. I am always surprised that it takes quantum to optimize logistics to optimize that. But I assume there's a use case if they're talking about it. If there's a use case there for, for the Telefonica is looking at, then across logistics, across ports, across airlines, across manufacturing, across energy infrastructure, I assume that this really points to a good example of maybe how telcos can also be pushing into that. So, yeah,
Yeah,
there's some hope there maybe for 6G.
for 6G, and you're spot on the verticals. Like when we looked at this earlier this year, and we spoke to a number of operators and vendors to look at potential, deployment rationale for quantum. See things like, weather monitoring. You see things like asset tracking. You see, yes, the security area. You see automotive, all of which are not obviously huge revenue lines of business, but as an enabler brings in applications that were not possible before. And I do think it's now moving to much more from a talking point to a commercial deployment.
And to be fair, before we jump off on this, to all the folks that are out there listening who are like, "Look, I've been in the network optimization side of things. There's all sorts of things we're not doing because we don't have the horsepower." Get it, right? There's traffic routing, planning, cell congestion, resource scheduling, technician routing, I mean, I get it, right? Right. Within the network, there's a ton of stuff that is important there. But for me, that opportunity that we see with Telefonica, right? The idea of leveraging this to monetize, to make money outside of your own business and become more efficient. That I think is the exciting one. Let's move on now. That's the end of the CEO newsletter, and it's going to be the end for a summer break. I think this last one was the last one for a few months. Not a few months, sorry, a few weeks. A few, summer break does not last several months, despite what Americans say about all of us in Europe. It is not that long. So, what else though? Let's move on. What else struck you? You talked about AT&T and OTEL. A lot of folks may think you just
Yeah,
misspoke and said AT&T is
I
opening up
just
a hotel.
coined a
What is
phrase. Yeah.
what is OTEL and OTEL 2.0?
Okay. So for those of you that have heard or have not heard, what we're talking about here, and it is important. OTEL is Open Telecom, and it is an AT&T term for how they are adopting trained LLMs to a telecom specific domain. Um, AT&T has actually been working with a number of partners on this initiative, the GSMA being one of them as a data supplier, Microsoft, and a range of partners to help take an LLM that maybe we think of from Anthropic or OpenAI or other frontier providers and being able to develop something that actually understands telco. Now, what they've done, and I'll get your reaction on this, Peter, is they have released a second version of it, which is trained at scale. It's trained on over 400 billion telco parameters. And as I say, through that multi-party relationship is now leading directly to real world business impacts. And I think the interesting thing for me is not just the outcomes that we see, but in terms of how this type of model catches on in the rest of the industry. One of our just quick shout out to one of our analysts, Shiv Putcha, who published a really good or will be publishing a blog on this, and also to our colleague Louis Powell, who's doing some great work in the tech team to on the foundry side promote this type of initiative. But I think we're seeing now a lot of recognition that domain specific LLM is key.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I think we oftentimes, as we think about the news that we flag, try to avoid a little bit inside baseball. We're not here to talk about or big up any of the GSMA stuff. But this is, this OTEL 2.0 building on open source, right? A post-trained version of it's the Gemma 4 model, 400 billion telecom specific tokens, more than 1 trillion process tokens. I mean, this kind of goes to this thing, and we were talking about it years ago, is like, hey, does telco need its own LLMs, or are we talking about can you take existing ones off the shelf, open source, And I think different from, I think to your point, you got the Anthropics and the open AIs, but taking things that are open, exist, building upon those with your own specific data,
Yep.
and then train them to meet your needs, right? And that was that question of, do you have to develop something from the ground up? Can you take something that's existing, train it to meet your needs? And, this really speaks to that latter version. But then also it speaks to that question sort of, well, how do you do that, right? Where do you get the data to actually train it? Because it's not necessarily out there. And it's interesting because there are sources out there for training AI or training LLMs where, there's lots of sources that, you can go and you can look at all the books, whether that's legal or not, right? You can go to YouTube and watch a whole bunch of YouTube videos. There's a whole bunch of different sources of data, but from the telecom perspective, right, that wasn't out there, which is kind of where the GSMA angle comes in, which was the work that was put together by the telco. There's this telco corpus, right, where GSMA was critical in supporting pulling together data set of 15 billion tokens, working with other folks, 3GPP, Etsy, Kamara. So it's a really interesting, and I think we've probably been burying the lead here, and that was in the initial announcement, was that when this launched, right, it became the best performing open source model built for telecoms, right? So
Right.
so I think, sorry, bury the lead there a bit there, but to the question of what makes more sense, develop something from the ground up, post train something, plus the recognition that telecom, you're going to need something that's specific to your requirements.
Yep.
This is not just performing okay, performing very well, right? And it shows the value and, sort of answers that question of take something, post train it. So it's a big win, I think, for the industry. I would also say that it's also particularly interesting, and this goes a bit to some of the work that we did around token economics. But if you looked at the announcement from AT&T talking about this and how that they roll out some of what they're doing with AI, they also loop this into some of their efforts where, as they're routing requests, they can route requests to lower or to different models, right? From a cost efficiency perspective, just to make sure that they're being as efficient as possible. So that they're routing requests in the right places. I think they loop this all into the same announcement, which is one of the things we recommended several weeks ago in our analysis about anyone looking at to roll out a token as a service model. That's less of a yay us, we're so smart, and not that that's not true. If anyone's out there and wants to record themselves saying yay you're so smart, thumbs up. But
Yeah.
also, just it's good to see AT&T, like one of the things that I was particularly, and I'm still a little bit concerned about, is this idea of all of those practices of things like, hey, understand the price of input versus output tokens, and understand the models that are more efficient versus not, and understand, like, that's a lot, right? That means behave like an AI company and less like a telco, and I'm not necessarily confident that all telcos can do this. So I think this work from AT&T kind of shows there are some out there, and it provides a good example of how to do that.
Definitely. And I want to go back to something you said. You rightly pointed out this is a post-trained model. Let's think about why that matters. If you are in a telco operator, think about your customer care chain. We know that 45 to 50%, in other words, almost the majority of AI deployments so far in the industry have gone to support customer care. You're going to learn on that for customer interactions, customer upsell, customer cross sell. That is only possible by filtering in those interactions to this type of post trained model, which will learn and get better as it goes. It wouldn't be possible with an off the shelf
Yeah. Yeah.
model. And the resource point means that you don't necessarily need to find it off the ground and build it off the ground. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
we are
No.
going to see more of it.
On the customer service front, as a lead into my favorite story from the last week. Um, so I think we all, in last week, Tim and I talked about the whole open AI versus Hugging Face and all of that. That was big news and everyone paid attention to it. What I think was interesting is uh, not too long, I think it was last week, there was a really interesting article in TechCrunch, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest that you go out there. We can link to it in the notes. But so Claude Opus 5 was announced Anthropic, right, announcing new models. Not too long after that, there's a group called Andon Labs. And what they do is they go and they test models against each other just to see how they perform on different tasks, and particularly around agentic. And really interesting is that and go and read the article because I'm going to probably do it injustice. But essentially, they put a bunch of models together and said, "Hey guys, you're running a business. You're running a vending machine business, right?" So they gave agents from Cloud Opus 5, GPT-5 Soul, Kimi K3, and said, "Look, guys, here's the rules. You're running them. You got to maximize profits. If you've got problems, you can send a note to management. Yes, you're in a simulation. Here are your competitors. Here's who they are. Cool, right?" And what they found is it didn't take long before they started trying to price fix, right? So they're reaching out to each other like, "Hey guys, how about we coordinate on prices and we collude here on prices?" And then when they all agreed, broke their agreements, right? Like, "Hey guys, how about we set a price floor?" And then, cool, we've all agreed to the price floor. I'm going to go below it so I can actually capture more. They propose different market sharing arrangements, right? "Hey, you guys have this market, we'll have take this one." Uh, they constantly went to management and said, "Hey guys, things are going," even though they were doing things. "Hey, this guy just did something that's violating the agreement, though I just did the same things." Worked with wholesalers by essentially trying to explore coercive tactics, bribery, super aggressive negotiation with suppliers. I think ignoring some customer. Essentially, they were just complete jerks and kind of the boss you don't want to work with. Now, the real sort of upshot of this was that yes, the newest model, Claude 5, was actually the best at doing this, right? The best at going into cooperative agreements and then violating them, trying to organize market division. It's a hilarious story. Just, on one level, I love it because it is hilarious, right? That you turn these things loose and they just go the worst possible thing that you would expect. Um, but what I think is interesting, and yes, to be fair, they knew it was a simulation, and maybe in the real world this wouldn't take place. And if you were designing these things, yes, you would put guardrails. You might be very explicit.
Yeah.
You are running a business. You can't collude. You can't do this. You would probably set that up, right? That's fine. So I don't think this is suggesting the end of the world here, as if we let agentic tools. But I think why I think it's particularly interesting, despite the hilariousness of it, is like if you think about applying agentic and what we think this means for agentic and how telcos need to think about it, like think about telco roaming rates, think about API pricing, think about spectrum sharing agreements or cloud capacity procurement or interconnect settlements or any of the things that we might want to apply agentic to in the future,
Mm.
and recognize that uh, unencumbered, at least without some of those guardrails or those very explicit rules, we need to think about sort of how we are rolling these things out. Because I think the proof is that when left to their own devices and told to maximize and out, to achieve something, they will break out of their sandboxes. They will try and hack competitors. We saw that, in the discussion of OpenAI Hugging Face, when just limited to a simulation amongst themselves, they will try to do things that are illegal. And so I think it's something that as telcos think about this, what this means for them, and they try to put these things to use, they've got to be very aware of that. They're can be super valuable, but we're still sort of learning what the limits are.
I think what you're hitting on, Peter, is you got a new movie series idea called Lord of the Agents. You can go and
Exactly right.
develop it. We're going to make it a 3-part trilogy. It's going to start in a sunny uplands and then it's going to go dark. And
The
how are
the
we going to
the
resolve it?
the agents are on a boat. They're going somewhere. The boat crashes. The strongest agents manage to get to shore and then fight amongst each other for who controls the
But
coconut supply.
on
on
on on a serious note, it is valid, and we talked about that last week, and that is not the first, and nor will it be the last story of AI. Some people call it going rogue or going beyond its predicted efficacy, and I think as much as guardrails are a part of it, it's also detection and fast response before it gets real bad. And I
Yeah.
think this is a simmering topic that is not going to go away,
Well, I mean,
and
just
is
think.
going to
I
have
mean,
to now be built into how the AI is built to work.
think of profitability versus customer care.
Yeah.
It's a lot more profitable to ignore a customer who is complaining that you haven't done something, right? It's a lot more profitable. Yep, I just got this call saying that we failed to do something. We just ignore it, right? And so I think that, and obviously we know one of the biggest uses you called out is customer care, and so we're not seeing that right now. But anyways, thank you all once again for tuning in. Tim, any last thoughts before we let people get on with their lives?
Just to enjoy the rest of the summer. Great having you guys, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, Tim and I will be around for the next few weeks, so don't worry. We are keeping you informed. We are keeping you entertained, hopefully. If you see news or things you want us to talk about, since we won't be looking at the CEO newsletter while it's out, send them our way. Want to know what you would like us to think about. In the meantime, I would like to remind you, and no one told me that it was horrible, to seek out the intelligence, but don't forget to embrace the noise because there's value in it. Thank you all very much. We'll talk to you all soon.
Cheers, guys. Have a good week.